me tell you about Drew. Drew doesn't care about the Pythagorean theorem. And the chances of making that formula adhere are slim. And he also doesn't care about that teacher who stands in the front of class barking orders and wants Drew to fear him. That same teacher who's been beaten down by this system so much that he's forgotten how to steer him away from being in that 20% of Americans who will not even make it through high school. And so that teacher vents in a staff lounge how Drew's a slouch, but his indifference to geometry has nothing to do with how that teacher stands in the front of class for an hour and doesn't allow students to put their heads on their desks. Like that lazy Drew who bows out every single day 10 minutes into class. But nobody asked Drew. Because you see, Drew finds it hard to keep his head up in class. Because when you eat a meal once a day, keeping your brain conscious because a teacher says you will do what I say doesn't override the pangs in your stomach. That 45-minute lecture is not going to leave a footprint. It's not even a distraction from the pain of that handprint that stings his back because he talked back to his mom's boyfriend. Have you considered that maybe Drew's not interested in your multiple choice test and that he's more concerned with hiding the cuts on his wrist? Or making sure he left the back door of his house unlocked so he can hide his passed out mother drunk on the couch from all of his friends? His dad's been locked up since the age of 3, and that sits in the front of his mind where those test answers should be. And those bags under Drew's eyes are getting very heavy. So no, Drew isn't interested in the Pythagorean theorem. And I think that teacher needs a large dose injection of truth serum and admit the reason Drew does not speak up in his class is because he doesn't think anyone will hear him. And that kids like Drew sit in your neat little rows like sheep waiting for you to shear them for high test scores so you can keep the principal off your back. And if they can regurgitate enough facts on these standardized tests, the government might finally recognize you and bump up your paycheck. And so you stand in front of a whiteboard and make kids memorize text. Meanwhile, Drew raises a metaphorical middle finger and keeps his head glued to a desk. Years of being kept chained to the steps of this broken ladder makes falling asleep in class visceral. And yet this teacher still expects him to remember that A squared plus B squared equals see me after class for making that metaphor literal. And here's a little secret from someone who spent many hours with students. Drew is not alone in this. Countless kids from broken homes have broken bones that were never set by a doctor. And heads packed with unspoken woes that occupy a space behind their eyes that doesn't let them see through this lie that they are not more than sheep in stalls, a simple cog in a clock that hangs on a blank wall. And while that hour hand ticks between 8 and 3, you'll have your butt in a seat and raise your hand to speak, and I will tell you when you can eat. For homework, read textbook chapter 13, and I don't care if you think school is boring. School is boring. Let me ask you a question. Why is one of society's most important tasks, the task to create its future citizens, so often so uninteresting? And why does it resemble almost nothing else in our modern society? You know, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, K-12 schools were designed to give students a basic education, mainly literacy, and prepare them for life in factories. I mean, they needed to know how to stand in rows and react to a factory bell and follow the orders from a single supervisor. This is what work looked like 100 years ago, and the format for schools back then made a lot of sense. But here's the thing. Only 9% of jobs in the United States are in manufacturing, and a growing majority of those jobs do not entail assembly line work and unskilled labor. But this is what school still looks like. I mean, it doesn't matter how loud a teacher yells or even how much money we pour into education, which I should mention is the highest in the world here in the United States. The majority of the school day is not captivating. I mean, we've got all this data that people cannot effectively sit still and learn for a certain amount of time, and yet we make young people with very short attention spans sit still for 8 hours a day and not speak. I mean, I can't even do that. It's taking all of my strength and energy just to have the attention span to stand here and talk to you for 15 minutes. Oh, I'm trending. Cool. And so our country, we are using a broken tool to educate our citizens. Well, I work at a school that emphasizes project-based learning. We attempt to merge this alternate reality that is school with the real world. Teachers at our school still take the state and national content standards that students are required to learn and retain, but we try to figure out ways for them to learn these standards in a real and authentic way. For instance, I teach a social studies and English class simultaneously to high school freshmen. And one of my major history standards covers the Industrial Revolution and the growth of manufacturing and urbanization, and then ultimately what effect this revolution had on society and culture. It's a very typical standard for a high school class. Well, once I've got this standard, I try to identify a theme. In this one in particular, I see this idea of modernity and the rapid advancement of human innovation. Then I sit down with the people I work with, and we try to figure out how can I take this theme and make it real for the kids in my classroom. Here's something we came up with during one brainstorming session. Every year, thousands of refugees enter the United States, often from the developing world, and they have very little experience with our modern society. You know, when they step off that airplane from Kenya into Grand Rapids or San Antonio, they're experiencing their own industrial revolution in a matter of minutes rather than decades. So I made this connection, and I decided to contact a local social work agency to see if there were any refugees in the area who'd be willing to come and speak to my students about their experience. And at 7 a.m. on a Monday morning, Denisa came and told her story to my class. She talked about how she lost her entire family to the Rwandan genocide. And this forced her to flee to a refugee camp in Kenya, where she lived for over a decade on nothing more than rice and corn. And then one day she was put on an airplane, and without the slightest clue to where she was going, ended up in Grand Rapids, Michigan in January. And Denisa had never heard of snow before. There's a lot of it. She didn't know how to speak English. She'd never seen a light switch, had never used a toilet, didn't know what to buy from a grocery store. She told the story of how one day she got on a city bus and didn't know how to signal that she needed to get off. And so she rode that bus all day long until it reached the end of its route and the driver made her get off in January during a snowstorm. My students couldn't believe what they were hearing. You know, when Denisa left that morning, they talked with each other, and they came up with the idea of creating tools to help refugees better assimilate into our modern society. And then for the next few weeks, they made these tools while they studied the Industrial Revolution. And at the end of this unit, this same social work agency came back into our classroom, and they presented their tools to them. And now, if you go into any apartment complex that a refugee lives in that recently came into our country in Grand Rapids, you'll see a stack of flashcards that 9th grade Samantha and Maya made about how to use appliances. And in that social work agency, in their waiting room, they have a video that plays a loop video of how to use the public transportation system in Grand Rapids that Damien and Tim made. And in a side room every week, a group of teenage refugees meets. And at the first of these meetings, they play a video on how to make friends in America that same Drew from that poem earlier created. Oh, also at the end of this unit, they took a very detailed test on the Industrial Revolution, and they wrote 6-paragraph expository essays in perfect MLA format. And if you ask any of the kids in my class what modernity means, they'll be able to tell you. Not because I made them memorize a definition, but because they saw it with their own eyes. They experienced it. I mean, it wasn't me or grades or even the content that drove this unit. It was helping Denisa. Last year, I took my students to a retirement home where they interviewed 25 actual World War II veterans. And they filmed the whole experience with their phones and their cameras. And then they created these little mini documentaries that they burned onto DVDs and gave to the veterans and their families to preserve their stories forever. And we had a red carpet event in downtown Grand Rapids where the students screened their films, and the veterans came and sat in the front row as the guests of honor, and over 400 people showed up to see what some 14-year-olds created. And you better believe, after talking to some men who stormed the beaches of Normandy, that my kids can tell you something about World War II. There is an algebra teacher at my school who needed to teach his students about exponential growth. And so he had them create superhero comic books with stories and illustrations that demonstrated the Common Core content standards. And after grading them and checking for the math, he loaded them up on a school bus, and they brought them to a children's hospital where they gave all of their hard work away. This is authentic education. There's a boy at my school named Ben. Ben is 16 years old, and he's dyslexic. For most of his life, Ben has struggled with reading, and this has forced him to sit quiet at school and fall way behind. And then he started going to our school, and this World War II project came along. And Ben found out that he's pretty good at telling stories. And he poured his heart and soul into telling the story of this veteran. And Ben was so excited that all of those people showed up to see what he created. And Ben realized that he was excited about school for the first time in his life. He found out that he can still love learning despite his struggles with reading. And this is poured into every class that he's taken ever since. That's why Ben's currently a straight A student and is going to go to any college that he wants. And there's also Kate. Kate was like many kids who go to school every day and don't tell anyone about the physical abuse that they experience every night at home. Kate told me that her former stepdad used to abuse her. And while he did, he'd scream things at her like, "Kate, you're worthless," or "Kate, you'll never be anything." And when you hear something enough times, you start to believe it. And then Kate's class worked on a science project where she helped actually redesign the waterfront in downtown Grand Rapids. And Kate was able to get Kate took the lead on marketing for this project and got several hundred people interested in what her class was doing, and was even able to get several news crews and city leaders to come to our school and see what their class was working on. And this girl, who was on the fringe of dropping out of high school, made a lasting impression on these guests, and then was offered a paid internship at 15 years old. People from all over the country come and visit our school to observe this style of learning, and they often say things to me like, "Man, that is so cool what you guys are doing. I wish we could do that in our classroom." And I say things to them like, "You know, Kate did most of the marketing with her cell phone. Do kids in your class have cell phones? I didn't pay this refugee agency to come and work with my students. They were more than willing to help out. I just had to send them an email. Cold calling is part of my lesson plan development." Because you see, our school struggles like many other public schools with funding issues. Over 60% of our students are on free and reduced lunch. We've got kids with learning disabilities and others who have never received anything less than an A in their entire life. But when you have a format where kids go to school to do real work, creating real change in their communities, school makes sense. Asking a student to write an essay or take a test is not that big a deal. School has to become more engaging than all of the other things going on in kids' lives, whether it's abuse or iPhones. But I'm not saying that we have to sacrifice all of the results schools traditionally strive for. I'm part of a network of 160 public schools that lives by this project-based learning philosophy. And kids within this network graduate high school at a rate 14% higher than the national average. And they score significantly higher on all standardized tests. But what if when parents research schools to place their children in, instead of asking what the school's test results are, they ask, "What kind of authentic projects is your biology class working on?" Or "What businesses does your geometry class collaborate with?" What if grades were secondary to college admissions, and what they really want us to see is a student's portfolio and all the cool things that they created for middle and high school? Teachers need to find the courage to make learning real in their classrooms. Yes, it is different, and sometimes very uncomfortable, but that's okay. Principals, superintendents, legislators need to give teachers the permission and space to do this. You can still have your grades and test scores. I'm just saying, stop making them the emphasis. In our society, we need to redefine what school is. Instead of being a giant hoop for kids to jump through, or a game, or even an obligation, it needs to become a part of the real world. So we need to shift the paradigm. See kids like Drew in a different light. He's not just a number on an attendance sheet or somebody waiting to collect welfare and be a dependent. He is a boy stuck in a coma waiting for someone to wake him up, burn a fire in his pupils, remove him from this alternate reality and give him a reason to want to learn and yearn for more. This system is not a machine that cannot be fixed. It's made of people, warm-blooded humans who all at one point felt what it means to be inspired. Bills, legislation, and money can't introduce schools to reality. People have to. You can call me young and naive, but I've seen the power of an excited teen. And Drew was written off by almost everyone, and at times, including me. But there was something about helping Denisa that shifted school to the front of his brain, where there used to only be fear and pain. And now Drew's eyes are open, and we will see what he can do when he's awake. Thank you.